welcome to you, and thank you for coming to Copenhagen and giving us this expose about the current relations between the two powers, and also in, as I can understand, of course, in a theoretical perspective. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you, Bertil, and thanks also to Kasper for arranging for me to come here. As you briefly mentioned, I'll mainly talk about the book called The Return of Bipolarity, but I'll also put up a number of the other books that I work on because it provides sort of a structure for my talk here today. I've chosen the title, The New Superpower Rivalry, the United States and China in the 21st Century, because I think this is becoming more and more of a theme that is becoming more well known, so to say. It's partly driven by Trump and his kind of rhetoric, and also the trade war between the United States and China. It means that more and more people are becoming attentive to the rivalry between the United States and China. But I'll just put this up there, this iceberg, because I think the trade war, which is getting so much attention, is just the tip of an iceberg. While what I'm talking about, the kind of geopolitical tension between the United States and China, which you almost never hear about or read about in the news, it's sort of underemphasized, and I'll spend most of my time talking about that. And also the kind of talk I'm giving today is rather academic. It feeds into the debate in academia about polarity. For a long time, there are strong voices for unipolarity, such as William Wolford, Stephen Brooks, Nuno Monteiro, Michael Beckley, that kind of group of researchers. And then you have the alternative view, which is the multipolarity view, where you have leading scholars such as John Mearsheimer, Randy Schweller, Barry Posen, Chris Lane. And basically, I'm saying that this is a misguided debate. They're wrong in a sense. We should be looking at bipolarity, and I'll explain more about that. My talk also take issue with the kind of arguments that you see advocated by leading scholars such as Graham Allison and his Thucydides trap, and others such as Chris Coker at LSE, who makes this kind of parallel to the multipolarity rivalry between great powers. Now I'm saying that this is again a misguided view. I basically have the same conclusion, that the risk of a conflict between the United States and China is increasing. But I think basing that argument on power transition and also on multipolarity, which is what Graham Allison does in his work, I think that is misleading. So I propose this other alternative way of examining US-China relations based on a bipolarity perspective. So if we think about polarity, I think the way if we go back and look at the work of Kenneth Waltz, you start with trying to look at the distribution of power in the international system. Basically, who are the most powerful states in the international system today? And according to Waltz, you can do this by looking at 6 factors. So you look at a kind of a combined score, which is the size of a country, its population and its geographical size, and then its natural resources, resource endowments, its political stability, it's about innovation and technology, it's about military strength, and it's about economic strength. And to be among the top ranking states, you have to score very high on all of these 6 factors. And then we can, of course, discuss whether other factors should be added, but I think this provides us with a definition of how to go about measuring how powerful states are in the international system. Once you start doing that, I think it becomes very clear that the United States and China are much more powerful than most other states. And what is important also with this distribution is not just the score, but it's to acknowledge that China is not as powerful as the United States. There is still a power gap there, but this is increasing. And it's increasing, or it's decreasing very rapidly. So over the last 10, 20 years, China, in relative terms, is catching up with the United States, although we don't have power parity. But what most people have been missing in this kind of debate is that the gap between China and the rest has just increased phenomenally during the last 10, 20 years. So if I ask you whether you heard of the BRICS countries, everyone will say yes, most people do that. But if I say, do you know how much larger China's economy is compared to Russia? Very few people know that. And then I say it's 10 times larger, and people get very surprised. And if I say China's GDP in nominal terms is more than half the size of the combined GDP of Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, again, this speaks a lot about the gap between China and the rest. So I think these are really important development when you look at the distributional capabilities. And this is very sort of, that's the third argument here. This is very similar to the distribution at the origins of the previous bipolar system. So in 1950, it was really not the gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States was more powerful than the Soviet Union. What really mattered, why you moved from a multipolar system with the three big powers, or Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the US in 1945, and then 5 years later, was because the gap between the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom grew a lot. So basically, that's how Morgenthau and all these classical scholars of political science, how they came to define the new bipolar system. That was the first time in history, in modern history at least, where you had two states that were much more powerful than the rest. And then, for the first time, you start calling them superpowers. And that's why I use the term superpower today, because the United States and China are far more powerful than the others. And great powers are, the kind of way you describe states in a multipolar system, not in a bipolar system. So basically, that's the argument for bipolarity, and the first half of my book is about that. So the rise of China is leading to a new bipolar system, which is sort of the first two books on the left side there. And then I start looking at, so what's unique about this new superpower rivalry? And it's certainly not a new Cold War. It's very different. And there are differences, in ideology, economic interdependence, institutions, the role of nuclear weapons, many things. But the most important difference is geopolitics. And one of that is that the rivalry is not on land, as it was in Europe, but it's out at sea, in the maritime domain of East Asia. And that creates different balancing and different stability. So when I edited this book about the 21st century sea power, I started thinking about sea power in the 21st century. And if you want to look at what is maybe going to trigger a war between the United States and China, well, it's the Taiwan issue that I will point to. So if you think about the next 40 years, another sort of time frame as the previous Cold War era, if I would put money on one issue that might trigger a limited war between the United States and China, I would say Taiwan. So I use this as well. I wrote my PhD on US Taiwan policy, and I think that will be a very, very important issue in the years to come. And then the last two books there, it says a lot about the kind of implications of this superpower rivalry. So it's most strongly felt in East Asia. And the biggest challenge for East Asian states is that they have China as their most important trading partner, but they have the United States, at least many of them, have the United States as a security guarantist or an ally. And that creates a dilemma. It's challenging for them to maneuver as the rivalry between the United States and China is increasing. So they are gradually being forced to choose side, although they don't want to choose sides. And I think that's what we are entering and what we're seeing in Europe as well. It's becoming more challenging to have strong economic and other ties with China at the same time as being a close ally of the United States. The Huawei case demonstrates this very clearly, but there are also other issues. I'll point to them towards the end of my talk. So if we think then about this new bipolar system, why is it so important? Well, bipolarity or polarity in general is not used to explain a lot. But as Kenneth Waltz said, it's used to explain a few but very important issues. And that is stability and it is balancing. But I also think you can use polarity to say something about factors, structural factors that basically are conditioning all states. So if you think of a small country like Norway, and I would say even Denmark, Norway in a multipolar system has a very different foreign defense and security policy than in a bipolar system and in a unipolar system. So Norway in a multipolar system sought neutrality. In a bipolar system, Norway was part of an alliance. Very, very different conditions. In the unipolar system, when I teach at the Norwegian Defense University College, and my officers there have participated in wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and been bombing in Libya and all these kind of military experience, all these military operations were unthinkable in a bipolar system. When the Soviet Union was around in the 1980s, nobody in Norway was thinking of bombing Gaddafi in Libya after he blew up a plane over Great Britain, for instance, in the 1980s. Nobody considered sending any Norwegian forces or military forces to the Balkans or to Afghanistan or to Iraq. So it was this kind of new polarity that made this possible. So I think you can use this for any country. United States, what was the United States' role in world affairs under multipolarity? Very different from under bipolarity, and again, very different from unipolarity. And now we're entering a new bipolar system. It will have new structural conditions on the United States, on any country you pick almost. So I think it's important to recognize the polarity of the international system. But then more specifically on these two factors that Waltz were mostly concerned about. So what Kenneth Waltz did when he developed this structural realist theory was to look at how this new bipolar system in Europe, basically, would be different from the multipolar system of the past. And he made two arguments. First was that balancing would differ because in a bipolar system, internal balancing is most important, and external balancing, meaning relying on alliances, is not that important. And the second argument was that the bipolar system would be more stable than a multipolar system. And he basically got it right. It was stable for 40 years. Then, of course, one can argue, was it because of polarity or was it because of nuclear weapons? But I do think that his theory about balancing and about stability is very useful starting point. The problem with structural realism today is that as we now are entering a new bipolar system, we cannot use Waltz's theory to predict anything about balancing and stability between the United States and China because Waltz's theory never compared two bipolar systems. And he never wrote about it. What you can do from his theory, you can assume that he would argue that there will be sameness. The theory would predict that you will see similar patterns of behavior in a new bipolar system compared to the previous one. But we're not seeing that. We're not seeing the arms racing that we had during the 1950s at the origins of the previous bipolar system. And I would also argue that we're not seeing the same stability, although of course that's a prediction about the next 40 years. But I do challenge that theory and I say it's unfinished. I think we can start with Waltz's theory, but then we need to add one variable, which is geopolitics, to make the theory enhance its explanatory power. And to sort of illustrate that, I like to show just some maps because that's kind of helps the thinking around it. So this is East Asia today, and in sort of geopolitical terms, there are quite a few aspects, but there are two very important ones. And the first is that none of US allies are bordering China. And the second is that between Japan or South Korea or the Philippines, there is water. And it's just like a very simple geographical fact, but I think it has a lot of importance when it comes to explaining balancing in this new bipolar system and stability. If, for instance, Japan was moved into the Yellow Sea, and you had a border, a land border between Japan, where the US has about 50,000 troops, looking over a land border and seeing the PLA with more than 1 million soldiers becoming more and more modernized, I think the dynamics would have been very different. I think you would have seen a different kind of arms buildup, but we don't. We have water. And at sea, at least now, and probably for the next 10 years, the United States is conventionally superior to the PLA at sea. And these are, I think, is very, very important, because in Europe, these factors were very different. So many of US allies bordered the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact countries, where you were looking across the border and you were looking at the Red Army. And on the ground in Europe, the United States were conventionally inferior to the Soviet Red Army. And the answer to that was nuclear weapons. It was an arms race. It was an arms buildup. So in the early 1950s, the United States was spending more than 10% of its GDP on defense, while the United States today spends about 3.5%. The Soviet Union at that time spent more than 20%. China today spends less than 2%. So geopolitics matters, I think, in explaining this kind of different pattern of behavior. The other thing which was very important was that because the United States had to rely on nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet Union, especially in the 1950s, but also after it introduced flexible response in the 1960s, yes, tension increased, but Europe became very stable. So you got the East-West divide, you got the buffer zones, you get spheres of influences, you get tripwires, you get everything that sort of were associated with the Cold War. So for 40 years, you have what John Gaddis called the long peace. Well, East Asia doesn't have this, because you added the maritime domain, it's very different dynamic. The United States is not threatening China with nuclear weapons if, let's say, China in 3 years decides to invade Taiwan. We don't really know what the United States response will be. While in Europe, they basically stated very explicitly, if you move into West Berlin or West Germany, we're going to start Third World War with nuclear weapons. We don't have that situation today. Why? Because at sea, of course, these are fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels, and it just tried to demonstrate that the dynamic is very different, that there is no East-West divide, there is no tripwires, buffer zones, spheres of influences. So it's a much more unstable situation because of geopolitics. And we don't know how the United States will react, because the United States are still confident about its conventional military capabilities to prevent China, for instance, from invading the Senkaku Islands, which are the islands you see in the back here, or the Taiwan Island. In addition, these are sovereignty issues for China. While the Soviet Union didn't make a sovereignty claim over Berlin, it had a buffer zone, and it was very happy with that kind of situation. It was sort of basically a status quo power when it comes to geopolitics. While China is certainly not a status quo power, it wants to regain control of Taiwan, it wants to control the South China Sea, and it wants to control the East China Sea. This is, again, creating different dynamic. And finally, this kind of pattern of behavior also affects, I think, the superpower rivalry in the periphery. So in Europe, you had this very tense situation, but at the same time, at least after the Hungarian uprising in '56, Europe stabilized, and a lot of the rivalry between the superpowers happened out in the periphery, proxy wars. Well, I think because East Asia, especially in the maritime domain, it's much more unstable, I think the superpowers will be more preoccupied with rivalry at sea in East Asia and less interested in proxy wars in the periphery or globally. So this is sort of three core arguments about balancing, stability, and rivalry globally, which are, I think, different from the Cold War, and they can be explained by this kind of geostructural realist approach. There are also other important geopolitical factors that one don't really think of, but China's geographical, not the size, but its position is very different than in the Soviet Union. So China dominates the East Asian mainland. It means that the United States has nowhere to place its troops on the East Asian mainland. Yes, it has some troops in South Korea, but that cannot balance China on the East Asian mainland. While in Europe, the United States had 400,000 troops in Western Europe. Yes, they were inferior to the Red Army, but they still were able to put up a good fight. So having regional hegemony in Europe means you controlling the European continent. Having regional hegemony in East Asia means you're not only controlling the East Asian continent, but you also have to control the sea lanes, which is different from in Europe. So this creates a different dynamic, and that is very different. No, that is very similar to the Western Hemisphere, where the United States was a dominating continental power, but it was not a regional hegemon until it kicked out the British and had control of the Caribbean Sea, the Panama Canal, and so forth. So that creates a different dynamic. The Soviet Union was much larger. It had a geographical outreach to the Far East, to Central Asia, to the Middle East, to Europe. So geopolitically, it could reach into all these regions. While China is geographically smaller and cannot do the same, again, it creates a different dynamic. So I think these kind of geopolitical issues is not going to go away, and I think they're going to be very important in sort of explaining the superpower rivalry between the United States and China. And finally, on geopolitics, there is also the issue of power vacuums. So in Europe, there were power vacuums after the Second World War. The new superpowers tried to fill them. That created a different dynamic than today. There are not the same power vacuums in East Asia as there was in Europe. And there were also a number of power vacuums globally because of the decolonization. So again, you had all these power vacuums globally and the superpowers trying to fill them, and you don't have the same power vacuums today. There is no similar kind of to the decolonization after the French and the British and so forth today as we had during the 50s and the 60s. So these things, I think, are very important, but they are not very much, I don't see it at least, being discussed many places. Let me then, towards the end, go through a number of other implications, which is not directly related to geopolitics. So this is from Chas Freeman's speech not that long ago, but I think it captures the kind of development that we are seeing over the last 10 years. US-China relations has gone really from bad to worse. And you can sort of categorize this as a competitive transactionalism from, let's say, 10, 20 years ago, and then moving over to a form of a rivalry, and now at the stage of adversarial antagonism. While we're not quite yet in this kind of fourth stage of enmity, but there is clearly a movement from what one call engagement towards more containment. And this shift is also fueling the kind of debates about economic policies. And I think it's really underappreciated how much the superpower rivalry is shaping this. So it's so much more than just tariffs over trade. This is a fundamental shift because we have a new superpower rivalry. So we're talking about a change of mindset from absolute gain when China entered the World Trade Organization, and many in the United States says, well, that's fine. They can benefit more from the trade than we do because we're so far ahead. But now, as the gap is narrowing, they come to a different conclusion and saying, okay, we are both benefiting from this trade, but you are benefiting more than us. That's not sustainable, no longer. And you have this relative gains thinking, and of course, as one moves further, you start talking about decoupling, and you start talking about the zero-sum gains. And this, I think, is not completely changing or reversing globalization, but what we are seeing is a very different world economy. And I think this correlates with the new superpower rivalry. I think we will see just more of that in the years to come. And this is going to complicate trade, investments, market access, and so forth. And economic interdependence is, of course, an important difference between the two bipolar systems. But I do think, although it's not going to be the same as the Cold War, we are moving now in a direction where you're going to have less economic interdependence. And when I'm thinking of whether we are completely decoupling or not, when I'm thinking of looking at supply chains, making sure one are less dependent on each other. And especially the Chinese are waking up to this, and so are the Americans. Ideological rivalry, of course, it's not the same. It's not the capitalist and the communist blocs and so forth. China doesn't have an ideology that they can, sell in the world, and people in other countries are aspiring to their ideology in the same way as communism was an important political force in many countries, such as in Western Europe. In the early Cold War years, in France and Italy, the communist parties did very well in elections, and this was part of the kind of Cold War rivalry. But I do think we are seeing a start of a new kind of rhetoric, and if you see what many of the Trump advisors and even the vice president, you look at their speeches, they're talking very much about a new ideological rivalry. And if you pick up one thing from the strategic outlook of EU-China relations, where the EU is talking about China as a systemic rival, it's when it comes to governance. And when it comes to this kind of ideological realm. And I think in the years to come, I think you will see more of the United States supporting the traditional role of freedom of democracy, while the Chinese are using diplomatic, economic investments, military aid, and of course technology, and selling this to a number of authoritarian regimes around the world, and linking up in that sense, and in many ways starting to divide the world into more of this two-camp that sort of resembles the Cold War, although of course it's different. Institutions, rules, norms, of course, during the Cold War, the United Nations were polarized, it was marginalized, it was hard to get any kind of resolutions through the UN Security Council. And I think you're seeing gradual steps in that direction as well. Many international institutions are becoming more polarized. ASEAN, IMF, the World Bank, the UN, and at the same time you find other institutions being reconfigured because China is gaining more influence, or they are breaking down because of China's role, or China is establishing alternative institutions. So again, I'm not saying it's the same as the Cold War, but there are similar patterns. And I also think that this new superpower rivalry is undermining the work on global challenges. Climate, for instance, the Chinese are, talking a lot about, They were in the Paris Agreement. But at the same time, what you're seeing in China right now is that they are going to reverse the production on coal. They're going to invest more in coal plants. The next 5-year plan is sort of indicating this. The Prime Minister Li Keqiang is saying this very explicitly. And I think this is related to energy security. And again, energy security is a concern in this superpower rivalry, and it's overriding a number of issues when it comes to climate. And again, it's more difficult to find agreement on arms control. The INF Treaty, of course, the New START Treaty, which they're going to start negotiating, all of this is going to be more complicated, more difficult because of this new superpower rivalry. Confidence building and crisis management, again, this is becoming more challenging. And finally, on the transatlantic alliance, there was a meeting, of course, this week in London, and again, China is becoming an important topic in NATO, and it's the first time NATO actually has worked on an internal report trying to assess the kind of challenges and threats that China is posing to the alliance. There is still a lot of work to be done before the NATO countries can agree on some form of common position, but I think the work that has been going on for the last few months in NATO is very important, and it signals again that this superpower rivalry is even affecting an alliance on the other side of the world. Finally, on China and Russia, there is, of course, a debate about whether they are moving from the strategic partnership towards a closer alliance. I don't see that yet. I don't see they have a need to sort of formalize this into an alliance. They are quite happy with the current situation where you have a strategic partnership, meaning that they are not in a conflict with each other, but they sort of have their back safeguarded. They can focus on their most important issues, Russia, NATO expansion in Europe, and China on maritime East Asia. And of course, if they were in more of a conflict with each other, they would have to spend more resources on the border in Central Asia and in the Far East, which is undermining their overall core interests. But of course, what we're seeing is that China and Russia is collaborating more on energy, on the Arctic, on investments, diplomatically. So it's a very important relationship to follow, and there is, of course, a strategic thinking in the United States and even in Europe that one should try to pull Russia closer to the West. And of course, there are some fear in Russia that China is becoming too dominating. But so far, I think that's is going to be very, very difficult. But at the same time, I don't see any sort of further steps toward a closer alliance. China and the United States are not doing military exercises together to prepare for a war where they are going to help each other out. The last thing the Russians will do is to help the Chinese in the war over Taiwan, and the last thing the Chinese will do is to help the Russians in a war with NATO in Europe. So there is no strategic rationale for an alliance. I put this up, some Norwegian words here, but just to illustrate the final, I think this is a very good way of thinking of it. In geopolitical terms, the rise of China and this new superpower rivalry pose an indirect threat to Norway and the transatlantic alliance. So for Norway, the most important security challenge is Russia. Norway's most important market is the EU. Norway's most important ally is the United States. Norway, as a small country, is dependent on the United Nations and rules and norms. But at the same time, if you think about how Norway is going to deal with Russia the next 10, 20 years, well, it matters how the rivalry between the United States and China look like? So I think that is illustrated by these arrows going around sort of the core and traditional foreign and security policies of Norway. And these are being shaped by this new superpower rivalry. So that's the indirect way of how China is affecting Norway. But then you have these other aspects, which are very direct, I would argue. So on climate, well, China is the biggest polluter on CO2 emissions. If you want to do anything about climate, well, China is the starting point. Petroleum, today China is the biggest importer of oil in the world. Of course, for Norway, who has so much revenue coming from the petroleum export, this matters. China is a big player in that market. Aid and development, I mean, you can go down the whole list and you will see that China is a very important and directly shaping many interests that Norway has. And same in the more new fields, where China is certainly also a very direct and important player in the cyber domain, in artificial intelligence, in telecommunications. I mentioned the Huawei case, but this, I think, is a good way of seeing how they are very much directly impacting decisions on security and defense policies in Norway. Although China is very far away, because these new technologies, they are coming very close to Norway. So there is this kind of indirect geopolitical challenges and very direct on many specific issues. So I'll stop there, and then we have some time for discussion.
Thank you very much.